The Fleet Street Fox came to online prominence when she began blogging and tweeting about the life of the tabloids at a time when fury over phone hacking was at its peak. Foxy, as she is known, clawed through the guts of Fleet Street and wrote about the news in a no-holds-barred style, tearing into the likes of Levison, Hugh Grant and Cheryl Cole. She recently outed herself as former Sunday Mirror journalist Susie Boniface, who now writes a column for the paper's daily sister. Her new book, The Diaries of a Fleet Street Fox, talks about life as a journalist whose marriage has abruptly come to an end and who has to come to terms with her own private issues whilst delving into the lives of those who she reported on. Susie Boniface, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. So, how have things changed for you now you've come out, now the anonymity's gone?
Not at all, which I wasn't expecting. I thought people would be disappointed or, you know, when you've been anonymous for a while, you can be anything you want or anything other people want you to be. I could have been blonde, I could be Asian, I could be tall or short or fat or thin, I could be infinitely more interesting than I am. And I thought that whenever I came out, I'd be bound to disappoint people who thought I was something other than I was. And I've been pleasantly surprised by the complete lack of trolls and people going, no, it's fine, don't worry about it, it's okay. So,
are you pleased that the book has been a success? I mean, it's done fairly well so far.
Yeah, it's very odd to see people with copies of it knocking around, because when it comes to the crunch, that's come out of something which was very difficult in my personal life. And it's odd to see people sort of waving around a scab, if you like, that used to be on your heart. But it's kind of pleasant as well. It's nice to know that something horrible happened to you can be used for something good at some point in the future.
And the writing these down for you say in the book, it's quite a sort of a visceral experience almost that you've written for years as sort of journalist being objective and sort of keeping your views out of things. How was it sort of having to try and get all that out onto the internet?
It was like nailing your eyelids to a table and then hitting them with a hammer repeatedly for a year. It was horrible. But it had to be done. It was a very cathartic experience, but it was very difficult to write about yourself in the same way that you write about other people and to regard yourself in the same unpleasant light. And of course after the initial writing as well, I've had to draft it and redraft it a few times, and you kind of start to see yourself slightly more as other people may have seen you. And, you know, when you're in the middle of the throes of a divorce or a breakup and some heartbreak, you just think that you're entirely right and he is entirely wrong, and he's a bastard and everything will be okay, and you know you hold on to your anger, and you only really sort of realise how angry you were a bit afterwards when you start reading things back and go, oh wow, that was a bit mad. Why did I put shellfish in the chair? You know.
And some of the things that sort of happen in the book and some of the events, I mean, it starts off with you attempting to murder your husband when you find out that he's having an affair.
It's an entirely fair reaction. I think anyone would do that, yeah. Yeah,
perfectly justified. And some of the characters themselves appear sort of larger than life. I mean, how much of the book is, you know, the raw truth and how much of it is fudged, so to speak?
It's all entirely true, but for legal reasons, I can't delineate one particular person's character because they could come and sue me and the book wouldn't be published. So where there are particularly different or weird or unusual characters, people like that exist, and all the anecdotes in the book have happened. They're not just stories I've heard down the pub, they've happened to me and to my friends, but I've had to give, say, the stories of 3 or 4 or half a dozen journalists to one particular character in order that no one's going to get too upset or get too big a head because they're praised too highly. And there are monsters and angels in there, and you know, that's pretty much what normal life is like in Fleet Street, I think.
And so, I mean, in terms of Fleet Street Fox now, you've developed sort of this online persona and she's become fairly popular. And you've got a fairly...
She's much more popular than me.
Well, that's it. I mean, you've developed sort of this person and then there's Susie Boniface. I mean, how do you go about every day sort of dividing up the two? I mean, can you?
No, it's quite tricky. The only thing I can think of is that Foxy generally wears red and black, and she has different eyeliner to Susie. That's my thing. She always has flicky eyes. Susie has normal eyeliner.
In terms of sort of branding, how important has that been for you in terms of getting your news blog, especially, sort of off the ground?
Well, some of the branding has been entirely accidental. You know, I picked the name and the red and black colours and so on and so forth for good reason. But there are people that react to it in ways that I didn't expect at all. A few weeks ago, I was talking to someone about doing a story entirely as part of my normal day job, and the contact I was speaking to said, well, I don't know if they want to talk to a tabloid journalist, I might be a bit uncertain. And I said, well, are they on Twitter? Tell them it's Fleet Street Fox then, if they can then go and see what I am like, and if they like me or not, they can make a judgment. And I got an email back from the guys involved with the story and said, oh my God, Fleet Street Fox, well, if anybody can be trusted, you can. And on the one hand, that's lovely and very flattering.
That's a great benefit to you.
It's a great benefit, and to be treated like Bob Woodward or something, that's fantastic. But on the other hand, hang on a minute, I've been doing this job for 18 years and she's been here 5 minutes. How come she is getting this kind of good publicity?
Envy of yourself.
Yeah, and she's doing, it's a bit like sort of growing a Siamese twin
Yeah.
out of the side of you, and she lurches off and does her own thing, and I can't control it anymore. People make up their own minds about her. It's a bit weird.
And you started writing, as we said earlier, in sort of, when Levison was just about to heat up and sort of phone hacking allegations were flying about. And you write about sort of phone hacking in no uncertain terms. And people reading this maybe for the first time might be a bit, she hacked a voicemail? How dare she? Because that's so frowned on now, and it has been for years now. But is that still your view on it, that it could be justified?
My view on anything is that if you're prepared to tell a reader that you did something, and explain your reasoning for it, then it's going to be acceptable to your reader, then it's acceptable to the general public. And I write in the book about the time that I hacked my now ex-husband's voicemail to prove that he was having an affair and therefore got divorced. And I think most people in the world generally these days have looked at a partner's texts or listened to their voicemails or looked at an email. It's not that unusual a thing. I haven't been reported to the police yet, so fingers crossed, touch wood, we should be okay. And I think as far as newspapers are concerned, some laws are bad laws and they're there to be broken. I think there needs to be a public interest offence in phone hacking and in a number of other very minor crimes as well. It's not a very nice thing to have happen to you. I've had my phone hacked, but I'm not massively offended. It seems to be a sort of an occupational hazard a bit. It was at a time. It's also completely dead now. It doesn't happen anymore as far as I'm aware. I think anyone did do it now would have to be an absolute idiot.
And on the terms of, you spoke about legislation, we come to Levison inevitably. What sort of aspect has it had? You work now online, but you still work for the tabloid press. I mean, what impact has it had now post Levison?
The general impact of Levison and the associated police inquiries, and we've had more journalists arrested in the past year than they do in Iran, has been generally to cause a great deal of fear. Politicians and high-profile people, lawyers, PRs, they now feel they've got the whip hand and they've got journalists on the back foot and that they can bully stories out of the newspaper. And they can, because newspapers have shrinking budgets and they have shrinking legal budgets, and they don't want to fight legal battles that they aren't definitely sure that they can win. It's a tricky time at the moment in Fleet Street, but I think the main impact is general fearfulness amongst the foot soldiers, if you like, and I hope that doesn't last too long.
No. And Levison, we all know, didn't put too much time onto online. And how has that changed? I mean, you came into press before online was sort of a big thing, but now it is. How has the newsroom changed with regards to online journalism?
Not enough. It needs to change more. I think I think most newspapers, especially in Fleet Street, see online and the print edition as things that are incompatible and that they're not friends. The Daily Mirror newsroom has just moved the internet news desk onto the print edition news desk, so they're actually alongside each other, which has got to be a beneficial thing. But for example, there are different deadlines to get things onto the internet. There are different peak viewing times for audience during the day, whereas you've only got one deadline for a newspaper to come out at the end of the day. There is a time of flux at the moment, and I think people need to kind of try and push things forward a little bit more and try and marry the two together and find a way through it. It can be done. People want news and people want journalists. People want journalism. They don't like journalists. It's just
that's the catch-22, isn't it?
It's getting it to them in such a way that they can pay you money for it is the tricky bit.
You talk in the book in sort of no unspare terms about life in the newsroom. How have things changed sort of in terms of post-Levison, sort of going out and actually getting stories? How has it affected general sort of trying to develop a story in terms of sort of, as you say, that fear?
It doesn't change anything for me whatsoever. But I've had the fortune to have been in this industry a long time before Levison came along, and hopefully a long time after he's been long forgotten about. But because of shrinking budgets and so on and so forth, and I think Levison and the police inquiries have perhaps caused a great deal of public disquiet at what journalists get up to, and therefore it's probably affected sales. That means you have even smaller budgets, and you have smaller staff, and therefore you're less likely to go out of the newsroom, and there's more kind of making people stay in the office to work on stories, and that means you can't have the same human interaction to get stuff as you would normally do on a doorstep. You know, on my first local paper, if you were in the office, the editor would say, "Why are you here? You should be out there getting stuff." And now the editors say, "What do you mean you're out of the office? Where are you?" It's different for that reason.
A whole new world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of you talk about the sort of the newsroom in general. And one thing that most people will pick up from the book is that the humour itself. I mean, it's a very funny book. Some of it is very dark. I think is what a lot of people are going to come to. How is that? Is that something that's generally as real as it appears in the book? I mean, do journalists tend to have that dark
it's a lot darker
humour?
than the book. I mean, I
This is a
lightened it
censored
up
version.
considerably. Yes.
Newsroom light.
No, I think anybody who deals with humanity at its best and worst and at its most extreme, whether you're a police officer or a doctor or a nurse or a journalist or a dustman, say, you're going to be resorting to black humour to get you through the day. It's just how things are. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you slightly more in one piece at the end of things.
And you mentioned sort of in the book this sort of almost a schizoid personality going between sort of developing sort of the persona of I'm a journalist, I'm going to go out there and find the stories every day, and then trying to develop a personal life. I mean, to you now, after all of this, you know, what's your view on it? Can the two ever go together?
Yeah, as long as your partner is prepared for you to be a journalist more often than you're their partner. But you know, it's a good and a bad thing to be a journalist. People don't generally get away with lying to you for very long. Is one thing. If your
Something
husband,
your ex-husband found out quite quickly.
Yes, yeah, he did. You know, he's a silly man really, because he knew he was married to a tabloid journalist. People don't lie to you for very long. You can find out what's going on pretty quickly. You've got a fairly good idea of how the world works, and so even if it comes to the fact you've got a problem paying your council tax, you can go to the right person and give them the right kind of rollicking in order to get them to do what you want them to do. But on the downside, it means that you're always suspicious. You've always got one ear open. You're listening for the next phone call and
Never
what's going to
off duty.
happen next. You're never off duty, exactly.
Yeah. And I now believe we have some questions from the audience.
How difficult was it in the beginning to sort of separate the day-to-day demands of working at a tabloid newspaper with your blog?
It wasn't too difficult because when you've actually got downtime from work, when you're not in the office or when you're sat on the doorstep waiting for someone to come home, you have hours and hours and hours to kill. It's when you sit there and type away on your laptop, which is kind of how I did things, or in the evenings when you're in a hotel in the middle of nowhere and you just crack open whatever's in the minibar and think, well, I'm going to write some of this out. So I managed to separate the two, but the issue was more kind of finding time to do it, which is why the blog originally was once a week, because over the course of a week I'd at least have 2 days to myself that I could write things, whereas if I did it every day, which is perhaps a more popular way to blog, then you would have problems. Couldn't do that.
Back to the workplace. Journalism has this kind of reputation as being really backbiting. Is that how you found it? Have you made many friends, enemies, people that you've worked with?
When journalists are your friends, they're the finest, best, most upstanding, most touching and humbling people in the world. There is an anecdote in the book about a time that when I broke up with my ex, who was also a journalist, that I found that all my journalist colleagues were refusing to gossip about it. And that in itself, it was sort of incredibly touching because it's such an unusual thing for any of them to do. But if you upset a journalist, that's really incredibly stupid. It doesn't matter if you're a prime minister or their husband, they're going to come after you and they're going to write everything down. Upsetting a journalist is a bad thing to do. But generally speaking, if you're one of the pack, as long as you follow the pack's rules, they're going to look after you, and it can be backbiting. It's an incestuous world. Everyone knows everybody else, and if they haven't, then they've certainly had sex with someone who has. But they're a nice bunch of people. They're not as bad as they're made out to be. They've only got very small forked tails.
In your book, you said that people think journalism's a very glamorous job, but 99% of the time you're waiting around, waiting for something to happen. So essentially, doing nothing is still doing something. How do you cope with waiting around for things to happen?
How does anybody do it? You have to find stories which are not incredibly exciting, but which are still out there. There's the constant, humanity when it's going through its normal daily business. There are always stories happening, even if it's really boring. You think nothing's going on and the phone's not ringing. There's always something out there if you have to go and find it. But journalism is about 1% rushing around, 1% trying to cover your backside, and the other 98% waiting for either of those two things to occur. But just because something is a bit boring, the trouble is if you've been a journalist for a while, anything that isn't rushing to the airport becomes boring, and you become inured to the normal daily excitement of deadlines and getting stories and everything else. The day-to-day stuff, the plodding stuff that you do in that 98% of the time is still very important to someone somewhere. So you just have to get out of bed and do that and put your work in, and then eventually you get the phone call and you rush off somewhere.
In the book you said that you will not have changed anything. Is that still your perspective now?
Yeah, crikey, look, I've got a book. I'm on the telly in Winchester. Why would I change anything?
I mean, how did you balance your audiences? Because having that alter ego and who you are now, writing for those two different audiences, are they two different audiences? And if they are, how do you balance writing?
Do you mean on newspapers and when I was writing a blog?
And writing your book.
No, just think of something different. Whenever you're working as a journalist, you have a different audience. Whether you work for the BBC or whether you work for your local newspaper, you have to have someone, your typical reader, in mind, that who you're writing for. When I worked for my first local paper, I imagined my mum. When I worked for The Guardian, I imagined my English teacher that I was writing for. When I worked in the Mail, I thought of my mum again. You know, when I'm on the Mirror, I think of somebody else. It's not difficult to switch between the two once you realise that you're not the most important part of the equation when you dealing in journalism. It's the reader that's the important thing, and they're the person that you should be thinking of most of the time. But it's okay, you can switch quite easily.
Okay. And one final question. The book ends with the decree absolute from your divorce, and you giving a sort of Viking funeral to everything that you've developed over those years. The next question, I suppose, is what comes next?
Well, there's another book written. It's just a case of whenever the publisher says to go ahead with it, and then we'll see.
And what can we expect from that, or are you keeping tight lips?
It would be a typical journalistic follow-up. That's about all I can say. It'll tie all the loose ends up.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.